I'd like to acknowledge, as others have done, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. And I would also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community partner organisations with whom I'm privileged to work. So in particular, Gora Butterfly Cod Torres Strait Sea and Land Council, Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre and the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority. And their concerns really inform my presentation today. And I'd also like to thank Carolyn for the opportunity to present and have some really interesting conversations with all of you, forge some new connections. It's been great. Continues to be great. As Carolyn mentioned, I've worked in the repatriation space since 2011. So initially as a staff member at the Australian Embassy in Berlin, and then as a research fellow here at the ANU. Here you see the project that I'm working on with Cressida Fforde. This is one of the main outputs, this digital archive, which I'd encourage you to have a look at. There's some really, particularly some really inspiring community voices to be heard as part of that. So in the course of my work, I've come to realise that many traditional owners see the removal of ancestral remains as a form of violence that's inflicted or has been inflicted not only on the deceased and not only on their relatives, but on country itself. And I think my impression is that Australian government policies and international agreements that deal with repatriation mostly tend to focus on the human impacts of removal and return. So they'll frame repatriation as a vehicle for healing and justice in Australian society, which it is, or as a way of preserving, revitalising and strengthening Indigenous culture, which is also true, but in my experience, traditional owners tend to be much more explicit about what the Australian government policy on Indigenous repatriation sort of just briefly touches on as the unbreakable bond between the living, the land and the dead. And I'll give you a few examples. So in 2013, at a handover ceremony for the very first return of ancestral remains from Germany to Australia, Antakarinja Matayankunjara representative Ian Crombie said, "When an Aboriginal person is born into this world, he has to go back to the Mother Earth to allow the Mother Earth to accept the body. When a person is not regained back into the land or the country from which it originates, then there is emptiness, failure, a loss of journey." Senior Ngarrindjeri man Uncle Moogie Sumner, a leading figure in Ngarrindjeri repatriation since the 1990s, recalled at a 2018 symposium at the National Museum of Australia how hard it was to try to make people understand that them old people, they need to go home because the country was suffering. Everyone sings about the spirit of Australia in their songs, and yet the spirit of this country is getting broken by taking the ancestral remains out of the ground. You want to sing songs about anyone, sing songs about the spirits of our old people that's going back into country. These are the things that will heal this place. And Neil Carter, who is the Repatriation Officer for the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre, or KALAC is the acronym, remembers approaching Nyikina elders to tell them that ancestral remains from their country had been located in the Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm in Sweden. They asked me, where did they take them from? And I said, well, they took remains from that hill over there. And the elders said, no wonder that country is sick. We can't find bush tucker there, no good hunting there, and we always knew something wrong. Now you tell us that remains have been taken away. Ancestors have been taken from that hill. We need to bring them back so the spirits can rest and the land can rejuvenate. And in this case, those remains have been brought back and placed back into country, and that's what you see in the photograph there. I think these examples demonstrate that it's a widely shared and a sincerely held understanding amongst many traditional owners that the removal of ancestral remains in the past has inflicted violence upon country and caused it to become sick and broken, and that returning these ancestral remains to country is necessary to allow country itself to heal. Now, conversely, environmental violence in the form of flooding, erosion, rising sea levels and the like poses a real threat to ancestral remains currently resting in country. For example, in 2017, floods destroyed the old Fitzroy Crossing Cemetery on the banks of Matawada, the Fitzroy River, which you see here. The old cemetery was on the right, the very right-hand side, where you can see banks eroding into the river. And I'm told that when that river is in flood, the water comes up as far as 10 metres to the top of the banks and beyond, so as high as chest level above those banks, and it can cut Fitzroy Crossing off for months at a time from the surrounding area. The floods destroyed the cemetery, they left body bags hanging from the bank, and they washed skulls downstream where they were found by children playing in the water. I think it's necessary to point out that erosion had actually been documented at the old cemetery site for decades. It wasn't a new problem. Local authorities had foreseen the risk, and they'd exhumed the remains of European pioneers in 2001 and relocated them to a neatly fenced off, you can see the little fenced off area, a neatly fenced off area in the new Fitzroy Crossing Cemetery. But no effort was made at that time to relocate the remains in the mainly Aboriginal burial ground adjacent. It was left to CALAC to respond to the concerns of elders and lobby the West Australian government for funding to undertake urgent relocation work. By the time that funding was granted, it's thought that as many as 20 ancestral remains may already have been washed away. Now, a lot of work was put in by CALAC and by community members. And in August 2018, the remains of more than 60 people were reburied in the new Fitzroy Crossing Cemetery. A traditional smoking ceremony was conducted by women at the gate to the new cemetery. Community members placed a handful of dirt on each of the small coffins built by the Fitzroy Men's Shed. And students from Fitzroy Crossing's Yiramalay School spread local wildflowers over the remains before they were covered and reburied, which is what you see happening here. And it's important to point out that the legacies of past injustices compounded the difficulty of identifying the remains. So graves in the old Aboriginal burial ground were typically unmarked, and only 16 of the 86 people known to have been buried there could be identified using historical records. So things like names on body bags, most people weren't buried in coffins, names on hospital bands in a few cases, and CALAC is hoping that it will be possible to use DNA testing to identify others. And in cases where families can be identified, they'll be given the option of relocating the remains of their loved ones back to their traditional country, because it's the case that most of the Aboriginal people buried in the old cemetery had actually come to Fitzroy Crossing from elsewhere in the Kimberley. So in some cases, they'd been forced out of their traditional country by European occupation and sent to ration stations to live and work in return for food and clothing. In some cases, they've been removed from their families as children and taken to institutions and missions under the West Australian Aborigines Act of 1905, which criminalised mixed-race relationships. And if we move 3,000 kilometres or so northeast of Fitzroy Crossing, we find that Torres Strait Islanders are facing similar challenges. What you see here is a report that was published by the Climate Council of Australia in 2014. It noted that rising sea level is eroding the viability of coastal communities on islands in the Torres Strait. Several Torres Strait Island communities are situated on extremely low-lying areas and already experience flooding during high tides. Building sea walls and raising houses can buy time, but in the long term, some communities may face relocation. And as these photos clearly demonstrate, cemeteries and other burial places are among the sites directly affected by rising sea level and erosion. Now, in May 2019, a group of 8 Torres Strait Islanders, known as the Torres Strait 8, lodged a complaint with the United Nations Human Rights Committee against the Australian government. I don't know whether anybody is across this, but it's still underway, and I think it's very important to support. The environmental law non-profit that's coordinating the complaint describes it as the first legal action worldwide brought by inhabitants of low-lying islands against a nation state. The complainants are alleging that Australia has violated Articles 6, 17 and 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So that's the right to culture, the right to be free from arbitrary interference with privacy, family and home, and the right to life. One of the 8 complainants, Jessie Mosby from Masig Island, has personally experienced the impacts of climate change on burial grounds. Earlier this year, he stated, "The Torres Strait has not contributed to climate change." So again, we see the effects of the legacies of past injustices, but we're on the front line of its impacts. I've seen human remains washed into the sea, and I've had to collect the bones of my ancestors from their sacred resting place on the shoreline and move them further inland. These impacts are something we weren't prepared for. Now, of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities were experiencing the impacts of environmental change well before European occupation, and analyses of Aboriginal oral traditions have connected them to eyewitness accounts of things like volcanic eruptions, meteorite strikes, and post-glacial sea level rise dating back several thousand years. But I think the case studies that I've just outlined have shown that environmental violence today often has the effect of compounding existing inequalities and injustices. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I began working in the repatriation space as an employee of the Australian Embassy in Berlin. And really, it took me a long time to realise that repatriation doesn't end once the handover ceremony concludes, or even once the ancestral remains have returned to Australian soil. Deciding how, when, and where to return ancestral remains to country is an extremely complex matter for traditional owners, and it's often constrained by lack of funding, lack of resources, and lack of access to traditional lands. And the threat of environmental violence disrupting ancestral remains already laid to rest is a further complication, and one that's only likely to increase in severity given what we already know about the current and future effects of climate change. Thank you.